Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture for English 2090 Summer 1 session. So today we're going to discuss visual narratives in films, focusing specifically on cinematography and then kind of visual metaphors within film and what that kind of means. And we'll give you a couple of terms and things. So you probably are familiar with this term, cinematography, but again, it's 2011 class, so I like to define kind of terms. It's the art of or technique of motion picture photography, right? Pretty simple definition there. The director, being the chief creative person, right, for a movie, right, is in charge of the cinematography, with the director of photography, DP, or cinematographer. Those terms are interchangeable. You hear the same, right? If someone says DP, director of photography, cinematographer, same kind of person. They're in charge of kind of the actual camera, lighting, and electrical cues, like crews, at a lot of times, right? So telling story on film, right, isn't just about recording the action, right? It's also about how the images are captured. In film and television world, right, this is what is known as cinematography. They still are concerned with visual metaphors and visual storytelling, even if it's an independent movie such as the ones that we're watching, right, or B movies. So just as kind of an overlap, right, between the theme kind of lecture and this one. A metaphor, in general, is a figure of speech that makes an implicit, implied, or hidden comparison between two things, right, that are unrelated, but which share some kind of common characteristics. In other words, right, a resemblance of two contradictory or different objects is made based on a single or some common characteristics. In literature and film, it can also be a figure of substitution in which one object is put for or said to be another, right? So let's just go over kind of a metaphor within the most dangerous game, right? So we have this passage here. Bleak darkness was blacking out the sea and jungle when Rainsford sighted the lights. He came upon them as he turned a crook in the coastline, and his first thought was that he had come upon a village, for there were many lights. But as he forged along, he saw to his great astonishment that all the lights were on one enormous building, a lofty structure, and with pointed towers plunging upward into the gloom. Right, his eyes were made out of the shadowy outlines of a palatial chateau. It was set on a high bluff. On three sides of it, cliffs dived down to where the sea licked greedy lips in the shadows. Right. So what do we have here? Right, we have the environment itself, the jungle, right, being a metaphor for darkness, despair, right, terror. We also then have the house, right, which is normally, of course, safe space, right, home, right, is now a very frightening kind of object, right? It's pointing, right? It's very sharp, right? It's pointing toward the gloomy sky, right? So it's not kind of a welcoming sight or anything like that. It shadowy, right, outlines and so forth, right, of the chateau, so it's mysterious, right? So the house itself is a metaphor for danger and terror, right? And then even we could look at it in metaphorically as the character, right, where the house represents Zaroff, right? It's an embodiment of the horrible but yet pseudo refined, right, elements of Zaroff. So we have all these kind of metaphors going on, right, all at once, right, and overlapping. But they help again, add to the interest, of the story or the uniqueness of the characters and so forth, or the fun element of the setting, right? So in terms of the visual metaphors, right, we often use this term mise-en-scène, right? And if you know French, I probably butchered that, but then it's French, so it's mise-en-scène, right? It's placing on stage, right? It's an expression used to describe the design aspects of theater or film production, which essentially means visual theme or telling a story, right? Narrative, story, and so forth. When applied to cinema, mise-en-scène refers to everything that appears before the camera in its arrangement, composition, sets, props, actors, costumes, lighting, everything, right, before the camera. The mise-en-scène, along with the cinematography and editing, right, of a film, influence the verisimilitude of a film in the eyes of its viewers, right? So it helps create kind of not only a visual metaphor, but also helps the kind of truth-seeming or realism, right, of the shots, right? Even if it's a fantastical tale. The mise-en-scène expresses the visual metaphors depicted in film that help enhance the film's characters, tone, right, symbolisms, themes, and all sorts of things. Right? So it's not a production term. So that's one of the crucial things. While a cinematographer, while a director is thinking in terms of visual metaphors, nobody really uses it on set, right? It's not a production term. It's like what happens after the fact, right? So nobody walks around like, let's think about this today, right? Let's think about the mise-en-scène. No, they're concerned about placement once everything's put together in the film, edited and all that stuff. See, especially nowadays, the film's going under CGI designers and all that. So that's the result, right? The mise-en-scène is the result, the end product, right, of everything. It's not a creation term, right? So it's the end product. So let's just even take, just a quick shot from Bloodlust here, right? So what's the visual metaphor? What's the visual narrative, right, within the shot, right? And so we see, right, so we have an interesting division, right, between the male characters and female characters. The female characters are kind of interested in Dr. Below, right? So they're leaning into him. He looks sophisticated. The men, of course, like, look at how the one guy especially is like, standing here, with kind of like the puffed, arms and chest, right? So we see all these kind of visual metaphors where the women are kind of, intrigued by this mysterious man, right? And then the men are still kind of threatened by him because notice, of course, the division, they're interested in him, right? They're not with the men. And so there's just a kind of fun way of arranging the actors in this way, right? Having the costumes be this way, right? Where, you have kind of a visual story as well as, of course, the dialogue going on. And again, a lot of times, especially with film, right, visual metaphors are not that complex, right? They're designed for mainstream audiences. So oftentimes, we're not dealing with, a really super hard to kind of unravel subtext here. We're dealing with clear kind of metaphors, right? A simple one too, right? So look at tone, right? So we have our characters, right? One is scared, one trying to be a protector, and then surrounded by these dark caverns, right? So it helps just create a tone, right, of horror, suspense, right, emergency, urgency, right? And so it's a very kind of interesting dynamic, right, when we look at kind of the mise-en-scène aspects. Even characterization, right? So we get a further characterization of Dr. Below, right? And again, he's always wearing these kind of, more sophisticated, refined type clothing, even when he's sitting on his like kind of like mock throne in this kind of cave, right? And so this contrast, the juxtaposition of him being refined, but then in this dark space, right? I don't know why characterization that should be hyphen there. I don't know why that wasn't automatic, but I'll fix that. No, but basically, we see that contrast, right, but between him trying to be refined, but then ultimately dark, evil, right? And so the visual kind of cues, right, help convey that to the audience without any kind of dialogue, right? And obviously, symbolism and so forth, right? We have this shot, where there's the skull in the island, and so we get obviously the metaphor of death and decay, right, and symbolism of, the danger and all that stuff. So again, when we look at the visual metaphor, the mise-en-scène, right, oftentimes they're very easy visual cues, right? And basically, it affords the directors to just be creative, right? Explore their kind of artistic side, right? As they're kind of, conveying a mainstream story, right? Or I should say, like a visual story, right? While the term originates in theater, it's not until the 1950s when film critics and the French film magazine, I'm gonna probably butcher this one, Cogère du Cinéma, began using the term mise-en-scène when reviewing movies, right? It is now a crucial term for film studies to help think about how directors and cinematographers create visual stories and metaphors in film. All right, and it's done by these kind of photographic techniques that, again, most film people, take from, or these terms maybe originate from photography and used, of course, in film. So we're talking about the rule of thirds, we're talking about composition theory, and we're talking about the quadrant system. And so when we get to these, so again, you might be aware of the rule of thirds, but again, 2000 level class, so I like to go over, especially if anyone's art major, you probably already know this since you were very, very young. But the rule of thirds is a fundamental compositional principle that most photographers and cinematographers, again, directors of photography, use to create a shot. The guideline proposes that an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines, such as we see here, right? So all important compositional elements should be placed along those lines or their intersections. And most cameras, phones, and all that today already have this. So, if you ever wondered why, this is why, right? The rule of thirds is, again, just kind of a foundational way of presenting visuals in a very interesting and pleasing way, right? So when we use the rule of thirds, right, this is a good shot. Again, it's focusing on our main characters, and just look at how they're placed within the frame itself, right? And then of course all the kind of, again, symbol with the dead animals, and we could talk about the mise-en-scène too, right? To echo the death, and all that they're struggling against, but or that they themselves could become like the victims, right? But again, it's just an interesting way where we have our one character who's not even like the super main character, right, in the center, but then just surrounded, right, by our other characters, right, in different positions, and it just creates a more pleasing shot, right? And so that's what it's really just used for, to just kind of create, some element of uniqueness, right, when we get into um, visual storytelling. Same thing with the rule of thirds, right? Notice here, this is a great example, right? We have our characters not really in the center, right, at all, right? We have our character here, Vincent Price, right, Craven, with the Raven, right? But they're not centered, right? There's actually like almost nothing centered, right? So it's just a way to kind of create a good kind of compositional element to the shot without it being any kind of redundant or kind of boring shot. Same thing here, right? Look at our main character, right? Blackula. It's all the way to the left of the shot, right? Again, same thing. We have Dracula in the middle, right? The evil one. But it's just, and again, we can talk about Mise-en-scène, right? The separation, right? How he's literally going to separate them, right? Soon, and foreshadowing. But it's just a nice way of just creating, interesting equality with the eye lines, but also, kind of metaphoric separations of the kind of placement of our actors. And so again, just kind of simple techniques that photographers and cinematographers use to just create kind of more interesting and dynamic shots. Static composition is another way, right, that you could create, again, a visual story. So these shots use the majority of lines on the page, horizontal, vertical, right? And the theory asserts that horizontal and vertical lines are soothing, calming, tranquil, right? And they have that effect on the observer. And so if we look at just kind of ideas here, where it's very static, right? It's very, the horror hasn't happened yet. They're maybe looking towards it, but they themselves don't feel the horror yet. So we just had this kind of static, very kind of rigid composition. Dynamic, of course, is the opposite, where all the diagonal lines, right, create this kind of unsettling feeling. There's a sense of movement, energy, excitement, right, and it could also create kind of disorientation and claustrophobic feel, right. So when Blackula is attacking, right, one of our law enforcers here, right, we have all these kind of diagonal lines to kind of reinforce the action, the terror, right, and all sorts, the possibility of death, right, and all these kind of interesting kind of lines create a more dynamic shot. So it's a very kind of, again, interesting way of creating kind of fun, movement within a captured frame. Now, high angle shots is another way, right? High angle shots look down on the subject from a high angle, right? So it often gets swallowed up. So the confusion that Dr. Crane is experiencing, right, when he's first introduced to the Raven, is shown in a high angle to create that kind of powerlessness, right? The vulnerability, right? The uncertainty of this character. Whereas the opposite, too, kind of creates the power. So a low angle shot, a shot from a camera angle positioned low on the vertical axis, anywhere below the eye line looking up, right, creates a kind of powerful character, right? So we see here our Dracula, right, about to kill, right, and he's more powerful, right? So it typically is done to make characters look strong. And there's even a low angle assassination and trunk shot specifically. Now, obviously not in the films that we're watching, but it is there because it's used to kind of create that kind of terror. And the last idea is the quadrant system. So this is similar to, and I'll post the video in Canvas, but this is similar in a way to the rule of thirds, but it's 4 rather than 9, right? So we divide the kind of shot into 4 to create kind of a sense of rivalry, right? So it's used in film usually when two narratives occur simultaneously, and we have one subject being dominant or subservient, right? So we see here, right, classical kind of use of the quadrant, where when we divide into the quadrant system, we have, of course, our two main characters, right, the villain and the hero, fighting, battling. So we have that rivalry going on. But we also, when we look at the top and bottom portion, we have another kind of rivalry, right? We have chaos with the fire, and then kind of all the kind of rubble with the stone, showing a kind of interesting kind of dynamic here. right? And then, of course, notice in the top part of the screen, that's where our kind of laser beams are coming from, right? So there's so many different ways to kind of create important kind of visual ideas, right? So obviously, if you have questions or want to explore these ideas further, email, post in the Canvas forum. If not, good luck with all the assignments this week and take care.